All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's training. So today's training, we are going to be talking about the NIST CSF 2.0 framework. So this is something that has been very, very hot off the press the last few weeks. It was released towards the end of February by NIST, and everybody's been talking about it. And I've had several of you ask me questions about this. So that's why I decided to put a training together to really do a deep dive of NIST CSF 2.0. And more importantly for you guys, as all part of my IT audit training program, I want you to also understand the implications for your IT audit or IT compliance career. So let me go ahead and get started with the training. So today's training, like I said, is the NIST CSF 2.0, and we're going to be understanding the framework. So let's take a look at the topics that we have for today. Here are the topics we're going to cover. It seems there are three key areas that I really want to cover. So the first area is an introduction to NIST CSF 2.0. What is it, right? Why is it even important? Why are we looking at this? And then the main part of today's training would be the NIST CSF 2.0 components. So there are several key components within it that make the framework what it is. So we'll be doing a deep dive into those components. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the implications for IT cybersecurity audit and compliance careers, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. I may allow some Q&A in the middle, but let's see how we do with time, because I know we have some limited time today. But definitely make sure that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or when I ask for questions at the end, you can speak up and ask for them, okay? I'll ask you questions. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to stop my camera just for a bit so that we can get into the main slide here, and then I'll be back on camera for other parts of the training. All right, so our first topic today is an introduction to NIST CSF 2.0. What is NIST CSF 2.0? Okay, so let's take a look at the official definition first. I always like to go through the official definition first before we then talk about it in simple terms that you guys can all really understand. So from the NIST CSF website, and at the end of class today, I'll send an update where you guys will get all the different links. But from the NIST CSF website, the definition of the CSF framework is that the cybersecurity framework provides cybersecurity risk management guidance to companies. And so when we say companies, this could be industries or governmental agencies. NIST is a governmental agency, so a lot of what they do applies to both public organizations as well as government agencies. So that's what the framework is for. And the cool thing about NIST CSF 2.0 is that 2.0 is the updated version. The good thing about this is it can be used by all organizations. So whether your organization is small, regardless of the industry it's in, whether it's in healthcare or manufacturing, or again, a government agency, or even regardless of the maturity level, did they just start building out a cybersecurity function, or do they already have a function that's been active for years, right? Regardless of that, companies can use this framework to understand, assess, prioritize, and communicate their cybersecurity efforts. So those are 4 keywords from the NIST CSF website. But before we keep going into an introduction here, one of the challenges that I've typically seen is that people don't even understand what a framework is. So when they don't understand what a framework is, it's difficult for them to understand what we're talking about. So before I get into the specifics of NIST, let's talk about what a framework is. As a reminder, some of you might know this from my class already, but let's do a quick refresher on that so that when we come back to the definition, you will better understand what NIST is. So what is an IT framework? An IT framework provides guidance on best practices. So let's say that again. An IT framework provides guidance on best practices that can be used to develop the IT cybersecurity control environment of an organization. So let me come on camera because I want you guys to really get this piece. When you have a framework, the framework is not telling you exactly what to do. The framework is giving you an outline, and it's telling you what the best practices are out there, right? That a company should consider implementing into their organization for them to have a good control environment. So again, when you think of frameworks, always think of it as this is providing guidance. It's not prescriptive. It's not telling me exactly what to do. But as an organization, the framework is telling us this is what we've seen work in other places. So this is what you might want to consider when you are putting your IT control environment together. So based on that, right, some examples we know are NIST, and there are so many different frameworks for NIST, right? We have CSF, RMF, 853, there's so many different ones, but that's an example. We have COSO, we have COVID, right? But the key thing I want you to learn or remember is that the framework is not a standard. So this is not SSAE 18, it's not PCI, and it's not a law like SOX that says you must meet this requirement. It's giving guidance on what you should do in order to have an effective control environment. And the benefit of following frameworks is that once you have a good control environment, then you have a higher chance, right, of meeting any other standards that you have to comply with, like SSAE 18, PCI, ISO, and things like that. All right. So based on now you guys better understanding, let me do this. There's folks trying to get in. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. So based on that better understanding of what a framework is, let's now go back to the definition, right? So the framework is providing risk management guidance. So this is very specific to cybersecurity risk management guidance for industries, government agencies, and other organizations. So hopefully that definition of a framework is now helping you better understand why NIST CSF is even a thing. Why is it that people are talking about NIST CSF 2.0, and why is it important? It's because it's giving that framework of how the cybersecurity risk management should be handled in an organization so that they have best in class best practices. Okay? So let me put this in simple terms. You know I like to put things in simple terms. So in simple terms, the CSF is intended to provide guidance on practices and controls. It is not to prescribe specific outcomes. What do I mean by that? It's not telling organizations you have to do A, B, C in order to get this outcome. It's telling organizations, here are the things you should consider for your IT processes, for your IT controls, so that you can be compliant. Well, so that first of all, you have a good, well-designed IT environment, which in turn will help you be compliant with the standards that we talk about in our IT audit programs. And for just to wrap this section off, because we're going to use the word outcome a lot in this training, so I want you to understand what I mean by outcome. The outcome means what the company is looking to achieve. What do they really want their cybersecurity posture to look like? Because the reality is a small mom and pop, private company that doesn't do a lot on cybersecurity might not want a very rigorous or robust cybersecurity risk posture like Walmart, or like Amazon, that's exposed to a lot of risk. So companies get to decide what outcome they want. And then based on the outcome they want, then they have the ability to say, that's what we want, and this is how we're going to follow this guidance in order to achieve that outcome. All right, so that gives you the introduction to CSF. Now, based on that definition and understanding that the CSF is providing a framework or guidance on how to perform controls, we're now going to dive deep into what CSF is, what the different components are, and then we'll continue with the training there. Okay? All right, so let's do this. The next section. All right, so the next section that we're going to cover in today's training is what are the NIST CSF 2.0 components. And we're going to cover a lot here. So I'm going to preface that by saying, don't worry, you don't need to memorize all of this today. I will be sharing links to the actual NIST CSF documents and the site where you can download the different documents. And then whenever I put this on the course website, it'll also be uploaded. So for today, just focus on understanding and thinking through how this impacts or the implications for your career. Okay, so let's talk about the NIST CSF 2.0 components. There are three components to NIST CSF 2.0, okay? So the first one is the CSF core, second is CSF organizational profiles, and third is CSF tiers. We're going to go through each one in detail. But just to do a quick introduction so you have an idea of what we're talking about, the CSF core is really the meat, right? The main part of the NIST CSF 2.0. It shows the hierarchy of functions, and if you don't understand what these terms mean, that's okay. I'll be explaining those in a little bit, but it shows the hierarchy of functions, categories, and subcategories that detail the outcomes that a company wants, and we'll talk about those in detail, don't worry. And then the organizational profile, oh, there's a typo there, sorry. But the organizational profile is showing the current and the target profile that the organization wants. And then the tiers is the characterization of the rigor. So remember earlier I said organizations get to choose whether or not, or the level of cybersecurity risk management they want. So the tiers is what helps organizations determine what it is or the level that they want, okay? So the core is the hierarchy of functions. The organizational profile shows the current and the target profile for the organization. And sorry about that typo, we'll address that later. But then the tiers shows the rigor. What's the rigor of the risk management practices that the organization wants, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the CSF core, and this is the main part of today's training. So as I mentioned earlier, the CSF core is the hierarchy of functions, categories, and subcategories that detail the outcomes, right? That detail what is it that a company wants to achieve. And there are 6 main functions. Previously, before CSF 2.0, the govern, that first one you see there, was not there. We just had identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. But one of the big changes with this particular framework, this particular version, is that the govern function was added. So this is just a quick overview of what it looks like in the NIST presentation or in the NIST document. And what you'll see here is that govern, if you look at this image, it really goes around the NIST cybersecurity framework. So let me ask you guys a question. I want this to be a little bit interactive here. When you hear govern, right? You guys have been in my IT audit class. We talk about compliance some. What do you think of when you hear the word govern? What's the first thing that comes to mind? There's an acronym, right, that should come to your mind when you hear the word govern. What's that acronym? And if you can't speak up, you can just put it in the chat. Let's see. There's an acronym that has the word G in it. I just gave you the answer. GRC. Exactly. GRC. So believe it or not, previously NIST CSF did not have the G. It didn't have govern in it. Now the reality is that it was kind of embedded in all the other areas, but what they've done with CSF 2.0 is they've actually brought it out and kind of called it out as its own function, as opposed to being embedded in the other 5 functions. So now there are 6 functions. We have govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And we're going to talk about each one of those as we go through the training today, okay? And here is just a very high level view of, again, the 5 functions. And you can see on the screen, we have the govern function, and then you have the category. So remember, the core function has the function, the category, and the subcategories, which we'll take a look at. But this goes to summarize, right, what the functions are and the categories. So let's go into each function so that we can get a better understanding of what it is. And you guys are going to start understanding, because now you'll see the relationship with some of the other things you've learned. So the govern function, this is the first function. Again, this impacts all other functions. The govern function is really around establishing policies, procedures, and processes. And one of the things that you guys have learned from the IT Audit Fundamentals course is like the policies are very important. The policies and procedures are important because they really detail the processes, they detail the controls. So a governance function really needs to have policies and procedures in place, because that's what's going to define what the organization should be doing. So when you review the govern function for the NIST CSF 2.0, you need to understand that it's about establishing policies, procedures, and processes that are managing the organizational risks. Now, the risks don't have to be just IT, right? Because other risks also affect cybersecurity. So there could be regulatory risks, right? Because they need to be compliant with things like maybe SOX, SSA 18, PCI, ISO. You have legal risk. If there was a breach and they were sued, what would happen, right? And if the breach was caused by IT systems, right? The risk, the environmental risk, operational requirements, there are so many areas that need to be considered for cybersecurity. It's not always just IT. And the goal of the govern function, when you think about this from a compliance perspective, is that it's ensuring that the cybersecurity strategy is aligned with the organization's goals. Let me come on camera and say this, okay? One of the things I've always told you is that audit and compliance don't exist just because, right? Because when you really think about it from a practical perspective, audit and compliance are cost functions. So when you think about, when I say cost function, I mean a company is spending money on them, they're not necessarily making money on them. So if you think about Amazon, right, their revenue function is when they sell, when they make money by selling things on the website. When it comes to audit and compliance, that's an expense function. So it's a cost for organizations, and that's why some organizations don't give it enough funding until they have a problem, right? So that's why it's a cost function. So they don't exist just because. At the end of the day, audit and compliance has to be linked back to the organizational strategies, okay? Audit and compliance has to be linked back to the organizational strategy. What are we trying to achieve as an organization? What are the compliance obligations we have? Because we're in business, as a business, right? What regulations do we need to comply with? So the govern function then is concerned with making sure that the cybersecurity strategy, whatever strategy they select, is aligned with the goals, objectives, and obligations of the organization. Because they can't just say, oh, I want to be compliant from a cybersecurity perspective, we're going to spend this high amount of money that the company can't even afford. It has to understand what is reasonable based on the business we're in, based on what the organizational goals are, and based on what we need to comply with. So that's the main thing about govern function. And then, so when you look here, all right, so with the govern function, right, here are the categories, and we'll take a look at subcategories later on. But if you look here, I have on the screen, it has the govern category, and it also has the function and the category. And so the first thing you see is govern, the acronym they're using, or the abbreviation is GV. And then you have 6 key areas here. So the first category is that the organizational context. Like I was saying earlier, you first need to understand what's the mission of the company, what are the contractual or compliance requirements that we need to meet. So you need to first understand, what business are we in? What are we trying to achieve here? Having that context is what's going to help the govern function implement, or at least design, an appropriate level of strategy, or the appropriate strategy for the organization. Okay. Then there has to be a risk management strategy. Again, this is also part of the govern function. So with the risk management strategy, you have to think about what are their priorities regarding risk. So if you guys remember from IT Audit Fundamentals, when we talk about risk management, there are different ways, right, that a company can choose to address risk. They can accept it, they can reduce it, they can avoid it, right? Or they can transfer it. So companies have to think about what are the appropriate strategies that we want, again, based on our mission, based on what we're trying to achieve, based on our outcomes. So you need to understand for the govern function, they need to understand what that risk management strategy is. Also, we have roles, responsibilities, and authorities. What does that mean? So this category is concerned about who is responsible for what. That's really it at the end of the day. Who is going to be responsible for each aspect of the cybersecurity strategy, the risk management strategy, right? And also, not just responsible, who's going to be accountable, because sometimes the people that are actually performing the work are not the people that are actually responsible or accountable to it from a management level. And what are some of the improvements that will be established and communicated to the organization? The other part, the fourth category is policy, right? What is the cybersecurity policy? We've talked about this when I talked about the definition. Policies, procedures, processes need to be well documented. So one of the main categories for the govern function is that we should have a cybersecurity policy in place. It should be communicated, it should be enforced, and also it should be updated as necessary. Then the fifth one is oversight. This is, and we'll take a look at the subcategories in a bit, but oversight is, how are we going to manage and have general oversight around our cybersecurity risk management program? Because you're not just going to create a program and that's it. You need to have activities, risk management activities that are done periodically to make sure that somebody is monitoring and has overall oversight to ensure that whatever strategy is implemented and in place is continuously working and being improved as necessary. Okay, and of course, any cybersecurity supply risk management processes as well, they need to be identified, established, monitored, and improved. So these are the 6 categories for govern. One of the things we'll do at the end, hopefully we'll have time, is I'm actually going to pull up the CSF 2.0 spreadsheet where you'll then see the subcategories and you'll start to see how this really links with a lot of what you've already learned in the IT audit program. So again, the first function here is govern, and it's providing that overall strategy. It's for the risk management function. It's, well, not, that's not the word. It's providing the overall strategy for the cybersecurity risk management, as well as the policies and procedures that need to be implemented. Okay, so let's take a look at the second one. The second component is identify. So when you think about identify, right? So govern is setting up the strategy. And then the second thing is, well, the strategy is in place. We have everything working. What's the next thing that we need to do? Identify is concerned about establishing, right, an understanding of what the risks are to the systems. Now you've gone from being very high level strategic to being more detailed. Let's talk about what these key risks actually are, because we can have policies and processes in place. If we don't do the work to actually identify those risks, then we wouldn't know how to manage those risks. And with this identify function, there are three key categories. You have asset management, risk assessment, and improvement. Okay, so the first one, asset management. What are the assets that you have? Like, first of all, what are all the systems that are in place? Servers, computers, the people are part of assets, right? People are assets to the organization. The buildings, software, companies use hundreds, some large companies, they may have hundreds of applications and software that they use in the organization. So asset management, and this could be a total role on its own, asset management is really concerned about, let's make sure we have a full documentation of all the assets in the organization. Because before you can actually identify the risks associated with your organization, you first have to know what those assets are, so that then you can document what's the risk to the assets, which is the second one. So once you first of all identify all your assets, the second one is risk assessment. What are the risks to all the assets, right? You need to understand what are the risks to our hardware, what's the risk to our software, what's the risk to our applications, to our buildings, right? To our people, to the services that we provide in the community. What are those risks? And that's part of that risk assessment process, where companies have to then make sure they conduct a detailed risk assessment to understand their risk posture. Okay, and then the third one with identification is ensuring that there are improvements, right, to the risk management processes and procedures. So once they've identified the risk, essentially you can think about this as the risk management process that says, we know what our risks are, how are we going to manage the risks? And there are several steps there which we cover in our module on risk management, so I'm not going to go back through all of that, but this is identifying how do we manage and improve on our risk areas. All right, so the second function is identify, and the acronym for that is ID. That's what you're using. So when you see ID in CSF 2.0, is referring to the identify function. So first, we have strategy, which is govern. Second, identify. You're identifying your risks by identifying your assets and risk assessment. And then we are going to talk about the third one, which is protect. So if you guys recall, do you guys, let me make this interactive, make sure you guys are still with me. Do you guys recall the first layer of defense? Who wants to remind us what's the first layer of defense from IT Audit Fundamentals course?
Operations?
The process owners.
The process owners. Okay, I see in the chat process owners. So when you think about protect, and I'm trying to link this with the audit program because I want you to understand why what you've learned is important here as well. Protect is really where you are implementing the safeguards. What are the safeguards? They are the controls, right? So you are implementing the critical safeguards to ensure the delivery of, this is the definition from CSF, the critical infrastructure services or the services that the organization is providing. So one of the main things here is when you think about protect is who's actually implementing the safeguards and the controls, all right? So do you guys see? Now the next screen, let's talk about the protect function. And again, the acronym that they're using here is PR, or the PR for protect. And then we have 5 categories here. The first one is identity management, authentication and access control. Now, I want you guys all have light bulbs going off here. Is that correct? I hope you do. Let's see. What do you think about when you think about this first one? When we talk about our ITGCs.
Logical access controls.
Logical access control, right? So again, that's why I wanted to start off with letting you remember that the protect this is where you're implementing the controls. So the first category is around how do we manage identity, right? Or the authentication, authorization, and just all our logical security and physical security controls. This category is saying these are the things that you need to do to implement those controls. And then the second one is also awareness and training. So if you guys remember from the program, we talk about policies, but if you also remember, we just don't talk about creating policies. We also talk about making sure that employees are informed of the policies, right? That on a periodic basis, employees get the policy to review and sign off. So there has to be awareness and training. You cannot have a GRC function. Let me come on camera for a bit here. You cannot have a security function that's sitting up there in their office, right, and putting all this strategy together and all these controls, and the actual people and employees in the organization don't know anything about it, right? If people are not trained, if employees are not trained about phishing attacks and things like that, that's when they'll get emails and they'll click on any link. So when you're in a GRC function, you have to always remember that whatever strategy, policies, and procedures you're putting in place, you also need to inform your employees on a periodic basis so that they are aware. So just some basic security awareness training on, first of all, what their rights are as a user, how they log into systems, password management, because believe it or not, I think I've told you guys this story. We have sometimes seen employees put their passwords in the drawer, like right there. So that's not very secure, right? So just some basic cybersecurity tips and how to avoid malware. Well, not knowingly. Usually it's an email they get that tells them to click a link, right? Kind of giving them that awareness about this is what you should or shouldn't do whenever you get a phishing email. Okay, so that's the second category. And then the third one is data security. This is also a little bit linked to logical security, but it's not just about the systems, it's about the data. How is the data in the system protected? So how is information how is the data in the organization protected? So for anyone, right, that's going into the privacy space, this is a pretty big one because there are lots of privacy rules around data, right? But it's not just privacy. So confidentiality, which is linked to privacy, integrity, and availability. That's the CIA triad, right? So how is data managed according to that? And then there's platform security. So you have the hardware, right, and the software. And then this is where you also have to think about, where are they using PaaS, for example, platform as a service and things like that. How is the actual platform being protected? So that's where you have, for example, the virtual platforms. And then technology infrastructure resilience. So this is about what's the risk strategy around ensuring that assets continue, all the assets that we identified in the prior function. How are those assets, what is the strategy in place to make sure that those assets continue to maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability? And organizational resilience, when you think of the resilience, is essentially if there were an attack, if something happened, how will we be able to come back as a business? So think of a little bit of that is the business impact analysis, or disaster recovery might be a better example. So how resilient is our infrastructure against just any of the risks that we've identified? So to summarize again, when we talk about the protect function, this is about the implementation of the actual controls, right? And the things that would actually help protect the IT systems and the IT environment, okay? Then the next one, and I know you guys may have questions, so what I'll do is we'll wrap up this particular section on the core components or the core functions, and then I'll allow some questions before we go on to the next one, because I can already feel maybe you're starting to get some questions. So let's talk about detect. So detect is, when you think detect, I know you're already thinking detective controls, which is perfect, right? But detect is the function that's essentially making sure that you have activities and processes in place so that you can quickly detect if something goes wrong. the earlier you identify a security incident, the better. So if something, let's say malware was downloaded on someone's computer today, well, you want to find out today. You don't want to find out tomorrow or weeks down the line where it's already gotten a lot of data or wreaked a lot of havoc really on the organizational systems. So the detect function is about making sure that there are activities in place to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. And again, I think I gave you guys the answer earlier. This is where you make sure you have detective controls in place. You don't just have preventive controls, right? Preventive controls is more linked with protect, and those are to identify, to prevent things from going wrong, right? But detect is, we know things can go wrong. What we want to make sure is that whenever something does go wrong, we quickly identify that situation and we put in place a process to quickly address it. So let's take a look here at the two categories for detect. So for detect, you have, again, you want to make sure that you find these cybersecurity potential incidents, right, and analyze them. And there are two key categories. You have continuous monitoring and adverse event analysis. So continuous monitoring is essentially, for those of you that might have some cybersecurity background, or we might have even talked about this in the IT audit. I think we've talked about it in one of the IT audit classes, but essentially making sure that there are continuous monitoring processes in place. This is where you have security logging. I think we mentioned this in logical security training, right? Where you have security logging, you have alerts that are set up so that when certain thresholds are crossed, or when someone that doesn't have appropriate access gets into a system, all of those are being monitored. And for those of you that may have some prior background in SOC, when I say SOC, I mean the cybersecurity SOC, those are the folks, when there are incidents, they get alerts, right? They get emails, things start going off in the operations center, and they know that something's gone wrong. A ticket gets opened so that that incident is monitored. So I want to pause because I actually mentioned a few key different things there that I want you to think back to when you're reviewing your IT audit program. When I talked about continuous monitoring, we talked about security monitoring, which is part of logical security. And we also talked about alerts being set up. That's also part of that security monitoring and logging. But then we also talked about when the alerts go off and their incidents, they are recorded and tracked to resolution, right? What part of our ITGC is that? Let me see if you guys are following.
Incident management from computer operations.
Computer operations. So are you guys I hope, we're still going to talk about the implications later, but hopefully as I'm talking, you're already seeing the link with some of the things you've already learned. So now you're just seeing it from this framework's perspective, right? So that's continuous monitoring. And then the second one is adverse event analysis. So whenever, it's just a fancy word for incident monitoring is what I'll say. So it just means when something has gone wrong, right? What do we do? So usually when there are large potential, not just large, when they are just potential incidents, companies usually have, they might call it like a problem management or incident management, but the goal here is saying that you analyze the event. You just don't say, oh, that's okay. There has to be a process that does a detailed analysis of that event to determine if it's a real problem or if it's a false positive. So continuous monitoring is you just making sure that you have those logs and alerts and security monitoring in place, but then the actual analysis, and this is also linked to that incident management that I talked about for computer operations. This is where you are actually analyzing the event and trying to determine what to do. And before closing out the event, you have to make sure that you've done a full analysis and you've determined what approach to take and whether the issue is resolved or marked as a false positive. The goal here is making sure that that analysis takes place in order to make the right decisions. Okay? All right, so that's the detect function. So let's do a quick summary, right? We started with strategy. Let me see in the chat. Make sure you guys are still with me. What was the first one? You can put it in the chat. What was the first function? With the G. Govern. So we had govern, right? So that's concerned with the strategy. What's the second one?
Identify.
Identify, right? You're identifying your assets, the risks. Okay. What's the third one?
Protect.
Protect. This is where you actually implement the controls, right? And then the fourth one we just talked about is detect.
Respond. Detect, yeah.
Detect,
Respond.
yes. So this is where we have detect, which you have your detective controls, you have your continuous monitoring, and then making sure you're analyzing adverse events, your incident management processes, essentially. Okay, good job, guys. You guys are here. And then the next one is respond. Okay, what is respond? So respond is, it's kind of, you can start seeing where there's a thread, right? So at the end, we talked about the impact or the adverse event analysis. So respond is actually where you're taking action on those detected cybersecurity incidents. So I think I might have actually talked a little bit about this when I talked about detect, because so I might have blurred the lines for you, but with the framework, right, they are separating the actual response, right? So what do you actually do? What are the actions you take? So this particular respond function is supporting the ability to contain the impact. So you guys, when I say contain the impact, what are you guys thinking now? Hopefully you're thinking about impact and likelihood, right? So that's our risk. When you have a risk, it's impact times likelihood, right? So when you have the respond function, it's saying, how do we analyze this incident? And if it's a real incident, right, it's a real issue, how do we reduce the impact, right? So instead of it affecting all the 5,000 computers in our organization, let's say there was a virus that was mistakenly downloaded on one user's computer, how do we quickly contain it so that it doesn't spread to all the other computers in the network? So that's just an example of what response you take, right? If there was a data breach, how do we stop it so that the data doesn't continue to flow out to the adverse party, right? To the threat agent. So let's make sure we have a response function in place. All right. So this itself is actually a function in organizations, right? Because you have to plan for your response, you have to communicate with the organization. Sometimes, you know, if you're unlucky and it's a data breach, somebody has to communicate to the public, right? And then more importantly, what are the mitigation strategies to make sure that the issue is contained? All right, so that's respond. And I've probably talked a little bit about this. So we have respond, incident management. So I kind of went a little bit ahead when we're talking about the prior detect, right? But you can see how detecting flows into actually responding. So with your respond function, you have incident management, incident analysis, incident response reporting and communication, and incident mitigation. All right. So with this, again, you're concerned with, we've identified issues. How do we respond and address them? So incident management, so again, this is the overall, when you think about how you respond to all the incidents and how you manage them, but part of that is incident analysis, right? How do you conduct the analysis? What do you need to review? Do you need to bring in forensics experts to see where it actually all started from, right? What do you need to do? And then you actually have to report. So this is what I've always told you. So with audit and compliance, you can't get away with actually documenting. So it's not just about having meetings and talking about these things. You actually have to document and report on that incident response, right? And make sure you also communicate. So you have to communicate, and you can see here. So with the reporting, it's not just the documentation piece, but you also have to make sure you document and communicate with agencies. So if there's a data breach, you're usually required by law to report that, right? So that's why sometimes you might get a letter in the mail that says, oh, your data was recently part of a data breach, blah, blah, blah. So that's part of making sure you're communicating the incident, right? So making sure that you coordinate all of that. And then the mitigation, this is the very important piece. How do we stop the impact, right? How do we mitigate this issue and hopefully make sure that it doesn't continue in the future? So the respond function has these 4 categories. And then the last one is recover, okay? So recover means, all right, we had an incident, we've mitigated, we've addressed, but things might have gone wrong, right? Data is already out there. Some systems are already very much compromised. So how do we restore capabilities? Or another good example is maybe a data center went offline, right? How do we restore capabilities or services that were impaired? One thing I do want you to realize is that this detect, respond, recover, this doesn't have to be something that necessarily takes weeks or days. This might be something, if it's critical enough, that happens within hours. So for example, if a data center goes down, let's say one of the AWS, Amazon cloud centers, right, their data centers, let's say it goes down. very quickly, they probably have a failover process in place, right? Where they quickly move over to another site so their customers are not impacted. Or so this might be within minutes or hours, right? So it doesn't, because they're separated into different functions, does not mean, right, that this takes a long period of time, depending on the impact, right? That's where making sure you identify and understand the risk comes in. Depending on the impact, they would just quickly mobilize the whole team to make sure that services are restored quickly. All right. And this is all about just improving that organizational resilience. Again, thinking about disaster recovery and making sure that companies can get back to servicing their customers in a timely manner. So let's take a look at the categories here. All right, there are two categories here: incident recovery plan execution and incident recovery communication. So this is more around the restoration piece, right? So during the prior phase where they are responding and they are getting information together, and they already say, okay, this is what we are going to do. So very quickly, restoration activities need to take place to make sure services are brought back up, and of course, then communicated to all the affected parties. So let's think about this. Sometimes I can't remember when this happened, but there was a time where on our course platform, right, you guys were like, I can't watch the videos. Something is wrong. So when I checked my email, I saw that the company had sent me an email when the issue happened saying, we noticed that our systems have gone down, right? And so we're trying to resolve this quickly, but you may notice that you're not able to play videos. That is all part of their incident recovery plan. It's making sure they communicate. Well, first of all, they are communicating with the stakeholder, because I'm a stakeholder as their customer. They are letting me know there's an issue. And then whenever the issue is fixed, I usually get another email that says, this issue has been resolved and all services are back up. Sometimes it takes minutes, sometimes it takes hours. And then I communicate that to you. So that's just another practical way of seeing this in action, okay? So let's go back through this summary here. I know we talked a lot there, right? But I want to go back through this summary for you to just talk about what we talked about here. So there are 6 main functions: govern, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So we govern. Again, this has to do with our overall strategy. We have those categories here. Identify, you want to make sure you identify your assets, identify the risks, put your risk assessment together. Protect is where you're actually implementing those controls and the safeguards, right? So you have your logical security, awareness and training, physical security, data security, overall platform security, and making sure you have resilience controls in place to help with your technology resilience. Then you have detect. So detect has to do with making sure you continuously monitor and that you are analyzing adverse events. Respond is when something's been detected and we've done our analysis, how do we actually respond? So you see there's a process in place for incident management. How do you analyze the incidents? How do you report, and which is document and communicate with your key stakeholders? And how do you actually mitigate? Meaning, how do you address the issue and prevent the issue from expanding? And then the last one is recover. How do you execute that recovery plan? And once everything is back up and running, how do you communicate to your stakeholders? So this is the core, guys. This is the core of CSF 2.0. And one of the things, again, I know at the end I said we'll talk about the implications for your career. But as I was going through this, you guys should already have been like, okay, now I see why all those controls and things that Paige talks about in the IT audit program, right? I see where that's coming from. Because again, audit is, you're not auditing controls just for the sake of auditing. You're auditing controls because they are related to the organizational strategy, right? The business needs. What's the business trying to achieve? What are the goals? What are we trying to do here from an IT perspective? So that's why you see that several of these functions that I have on the screen are linked to a lot of the things that you already learned. Okay, but I also want to mention one thing. Is CSF a prescription, or does it prescribe exactly the way companies need to do things? Let me see if you guys were listening at the beginning. Is CSF prescriptive? Is it telling you this is exactly what you need to do? No.
That's good. These are guidelines.
They are guidelines. And that's why you can see that when I was describing these functions, hold on, people are trying to join. So when I was describing the functions, you could see that I started blurring the line somewhere, because companies don't need to separate all their functions into 6. Okay, companies can choose to group this and say, you know what, we're just going to have one function is going to have detect, respond, and recover. Because as we were walking through, you saw the thread, right? You saw how everything was related. So what that means is, but from a framework perspective, it has to be very, very detailed, so that companies that are not that mature, that may not have that maturity or that understanding of cybersecurity, so that you're really just breaking it down into little, very explanatory pieces for them to say, okay, these are all the exact distinct pieces you must have. But as organizations mature, the lines may be blurred, but the key might be, even if it's blurred, all the categories, all the activities are still taking place, because that's what's important, right? What's important is not saying, show me how you have everything separated into 6 functions. No, it's about, do you have those controls in place? Have you made sure you're safeguarding your cybersecurity assets? What do you have in place? So I don't want you to go out there thinking about this from a very theoretical perspective, or thinking about it from a textbook. Remember, I always say, you don't want to give textbook responses. Think about it from the practical application piece. How is this practically implemented in organizations? Okay, so that brings us to the end of the core function. But before I go on to the second one, which is the CSF organizational profile, let me see if you guys have any questions. Welcome. All right, so let's go on. So the next one is CSF organizational profiles, right? So this is our second component. I know we're a little bit over time. Well, no, I said 60 to 90 minutes, so we're still good. Okay, so this is the CSF organizational profile. Okay, so what's the CSF organizational profile? And this is just simply the description of the current and target cybersecurity posture based on the core outcomes that a company wants. So let's just break that down a little bit simpler. There are 2 key profiles that a company can choose to have. One is their current profile that essentially says, this is currently where we are with our cybersecurity posture. And then a target profile that says, this is what we want. This is where we want to be. This is our desired outcome for our risk management objective, okay? Just a very quick note before we go deeper into this. Very quick note, there's a concept called community profiles. And this is where companies have come together to develop a baseline profile based on the industry. So maybe retailers might say, we're all in the same retail industry. We have similar risks, right? So we're going to come up with a profile that's generic for this industry, and anybody in the retail industry can use that as a baseline if they want. And I'll show you what an example of a profile looks like in a bit. But just wanted to mention this here as well. And like I said, I'll share links and the files that related to this training. Now, how do you create an organizational profile, right? Because you can just say current profile or target profile, but how do you really create that profile? There are 5 steps. 1, you scope it, right? So for scoping, you gather information, you create the profile, you analyze any gaps, and then you implement the action plan. So let's take a look at those 5 steps. So I know there are a lot of words on the slide, but I didn't want to shorten it too much for you guys. But the first piece is determining the scope of the organizational profile. But before we actually talk about that, an organization can have multiple profiles, right? Depending on the scope. They might want to have a profile for the cybersecurity area. They might want to have a profile for the supply chain risks. They can choose to have different profiles that focus on a different aspect of risk or a different aspect of the business. But at the end of the day, before you create an organizational profile, you have to understand what's the scope, right? What is the scope based on the assumptions I want to make? So if this is just for one particular part of the, let's say, asset management area, your profile that you build will be all based on asset management. Now that you've kind of put your scope together, then you'll say, okay, what information do I need, right? So I have my scope. So if you think about this in audit terms, this is also talking about where you actually start gathering information. What policies are in place, right? And you can get information from lots of places. the risk profile already created for enterprises, the requirements, the standards that need to be followed. So maybe this is based on having to meet PCI requirements. So you will need all information required for PCI DSS, for example. But the second thing is making sure you gather the information that you need. The third one is actually then based on understanding the scope of the profile you want and the information you've gathered, you actually document, okay, these are the outcomes that I want, all right? And again, if you are in a particular industry that already has a community profile, you can leverage that as a starting point instead of starting from a blank sheet. And then the fourth part is, okay, so if there's a gap between my current and target profile, so I've already documented what I'm currently doing, and I've documented where I want to be from a cybersecurity risk posture perspective. What's that gap, right? And how do I address them? So this is where you start documenting, okay, these are all the risks we've identified. These are the issues. What's our plan of action? How do we address this? The plan of action and milestone, it's called POAM, is very much in the federal space. So you might not see that in regular organizations. They might just call it a remediation plan, right? But in the NIST CSF 2.0, they are using POAM because that's a federal term, but you might just see this like a mitigation or remediation plan or something like that. But essentially here you're analyzing the gaps and then creating an action plan to fix, mitigate, or address those gaps. And then the last one is actually implementing the plan. So now that you have a plan in place, you actually follow the plan to actually implement controls that will address the gap, right? And then all that is targeted at meeting that target profile. So again, similar to remediation plans, this may have an overall deadline. So let's look at an example here. And I rushed through those definitions because I know sometimes they are theoretical. I wanted to kind of get to the actual example here. So on the screen, right, so this is a simplified example of this is the outcome that's desired, right? They want configuration management practices that are established and applied. Very specific. So it's about our configuration management practices. So what the current profile says, what are they currently doing, right? So the configuration management policy is there. So this document, I believe, was created in 2024 by NIST, right? That's when they issued it. But you can see here, so it was last updated in 2022. That's well over a year. They're informal processes. So you can already see that this is not very, very mature. And so the status here is saying configuration management is partially implemented within the organization. Some systems don't follow baseline. So they've done an internal rating saying this is 3 out of 5. Again, because this is an outcome that the company is saying that it's important to them, they've rated it as a priority. And then this is what they're saying their target profile is, right? They want configuration management to be very specific, to actually be used and enforced in the organization, and that any control, that the policy requires change control processes to be followed. So you guys already know that if any changes need to be made to the configuration of a company, they need to follow change management controls or the change management process, right? So maybe in the current profile, they're not doing that, right? Because it says change control processes are not consistently followed. So the target is saying this is what we want. And then the procedures, which are more detailed, are saying that, okay, so each division will have a change configuration management plan. It's going to be maintained, implemented, enforced. The settings will also, let me read that differently. As well as it maintains, implements, and enforces configuration baselines and settings. So it's saying all the configuration baselines, let's think passwords to make it easy, right? So all the password configurations and settings need to be properly implemented, to be enforced, to be documented, right? And if there are any changes, it needs to follow our change management process. So you can see that they are at a certain place and they have a target. So they need to identify the gap. For example, change control process is not being followed, and here change control processes are being followed. So they need to identify those gaps and say, what do we actually need to do and implement as an organization to make that a reality? So even though I went through those 5 steps, I think this might have even made it clearer. I went through those 5 steps because that's what we have in NIST CSF 2.0, but this is what the practical implication is, right? It's not about stating the 5 steps to risk profile. It's about actually being able to identify what the current profile is, where we're trying to go with our target, what the gap is, and how to address them. Okay, so this is an example, and on the screen here, so in order to get to that summary that I just showed you, right, CSF has put together this document. So it's all accessible on the NIST CSF 2.0 site. I'll share links to that. But and I just copied a screenshot of just a part of it because it's a pretty long document. But you can see, right, included in profile means, is it part of the scope of this particular profile? Remember, you can have different profiles depending on scope. So you get to answer all those questions. Was the priority, was the status, are there policies, are there internal practices, roles, responsibilities, evidence? So essentially all this information that you gather, remember that second step was making sure you gathered information, right, for your current and also for your target. That's what will help you after you get and document all this information. That's what's going to help you actually put together this summary that tells you what you need to do. Okay? All right. So let me pause there. That's it for the CSF, the organizational profile. So I shared a template and an example. All right, so let's go through the third section, and then, so we've done our Q&A. Let's go through the third section and then we'll wrap up. So thank you all for hanging out with me here today. So the third one is CSF tiers, right? Now, CSF tiers, like I was saying earlier, is the characterization of the rigor. Like, let me use simple terms. This is essentially saying, how serious do we want to be about our risk management practices? Like, do we want to be tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 4? Partial, risk-informed, repeatable, or adaptive? Like, organizations do get to say what level of risk they want to be in. Because again, when you think about risk, when we talk about risk response, right? Some companies you can avoid, you can transfer, you can accept, right? You can mitigate. So there are different ways. Companies all are in business for different things, and depending on the different area, right? So for different areas, for one area, they might say, oh, this area is serious enough. We want to make sure that we are tier 3, right? Or this area is not that critical, but so we just want to be tier 2 in this area. So the CSF tiers are essentially just saying, what is the rigor that we want to say we have for our risk governance? And then based on the tier they've selected, that's what they then use to inform their organizational profile, right? So based on whether they want to be tier 1, 2, 3, or 4, when they put their organizational profile together, it'll be based on that. Maybe everybody doesn't want to be adaptive at that very high level for configuration management. Maybe they just want to be risk informed. That's their decision to make. Of course, that would be based on a risk analysis of them determining that if any risk in that area was actualized, they'll be fine with it, right? So they've already done that risk analysis, but companies do get to choose that. And then again, those tiers can be used to set the tone for organizational risk management across all the different areas. So again, different parts or different aspects of an organization, they might select a different tier if they want. So for example, just a quick explanation. Partial is when it's kind of ad hoc. Maybe they don't really have a lot of policies or it's not really followed up on. We kind of do it when we need to, right? Risk informed, there's awareness, right? So we know there are risks, but we may not fully have organization-wide risk management process. So maybe within this department, we do something, but it might be different in another department, and we may not all see what each other is seeing, but we all know what the risks are. Repeatable, this is where you have formal processes, right? So they are approved, they are reviewed periodically. It's essentially a pretty good process where it's consistent to a certain level and you can repeat it. And then tier 4 is adaptive. So this is formal, organization-wide approach. Let's say there's a change management process, a policy that everybody knows about. So we choose that we want to be adaptive in all areas or certain areas. And that just means we are very, very mature in that specific area. Okay, so that's really it for tiers. So the tiers really are, how is a tier selected for the different area, and based on that tier selection, the organizational profile is created, which will be the current and the target that would then need to be analyzed for a gap, for the gap analysis. Okay. All right, so we're about to wrap up, guys. Thank you. We might be a few minutes over, so please bear with me. So again, here are the 3 components that we discussed. And I mentioned this was the core part of the training, right? So you have the CSF core, CSF organizational profiles, and CSF tiers. CSF core is the main piece, right? So that's where you have those 6 functions that we mentioned, categories and subcategories that detail the outcomes, right? Then you have the actual profiles that describe the current and target postures. And then you have the tiers that just say, you know, what level or how serious do we want to be with our cybersecurity risk governance? What are we comfortable with in actuality? All right. So that's the summary there. So let's talk about the last section here. And I think this is where you guys would hopefully get some additional value. So what does this all mean? I'm sure if you guys were on LinkedIn the last few weeks, raise your hands if you're like me. Everybody wants to talk about NIST CSF 2.0 and everybody's running. What is it? How does it affect me? Is that you? Let me check the chat. Like, what does it mean? Hold on, let me see the chat. Kika said yes. Okay. Honestly, at the end of the day, that's why when I started and I talked about the description or the definition, it's a framework. Okay, let me come on camera here a little bit. It's really a framework that organizations are using or that organizations can use to develop their cybersecurity risk management strategy and their profile. The framework is intended to help with the design of the environment. So let's talk about how this might be the implication, sorry, the implication for audit and compliance. All right, so I actually put both on the same slide. I should have separated them, but that's okay. If you're in the audit space, you might get to work with companies to perform a gap assessment between, okay, here's your current profile and here's your target profile. I can't remember someone asked the question about, what do I do if I want to develop a profile for a customer? Because you're an auditor, right? When you've gone through my IT audit fundamentals class, we've talked a lot about controls. You learned a lot about controls. You learned about the control considerations, why they're implemented and how they're implemented. And what that should have done for you is not just tell you how to test controls, it tells you the importance of controls. And with reverse engineering, it tells you how to implement controls. So let me see in the chat, right? Can you guys, if someone comes to you and says, we're having some issues around logical security, we have processes that are not really mature, or our access management process is not really mature, what are some of the things that we can do based on trying to get to a more mature level? Do you feel like you will be able to tell them at least 5 to 6 more, really, but let's just go low, 5 to 6 controls that they should implement to help fix that gap? Let me see you in the chat, or you can speak up. Do you all get that question? Yes, and I see a lot of yeses in the chat. And that's exactly what the implication is. Because you now know more about what NIST CSF is as the framework, you understand the concept that the core functions are giving that ideal, right, of this is where things should be. But most companies are not ideal. They will have gaps. So your knowledge of an auditor, because I'm auditing and this is what I'm looking for, it gives you that unique vantage point on this is what you need to have to fix the gap. And there are so many rules that are really around that remediation management, gap assessment. And your IT audit knowledge makes you the perfect person to be able to say, this is wrong, this is how you fix it, right? So that's one implication. So it doesn't change much from what you're actually doing. It maybe just changes the way you talk about it, right? You're still performing that same function of understanding right? I'm talking from a perspective where you're being hired as internal audit, not external, right? So you are being hired as internal audit to come help them put things in place. So that's what I'm talking about from that perspective. So your audit knowledge gives you that advantage. So that's one. And then this is also linked to the other one. So the first one was really more about gap assessment. And I think I kind of made it to the same thing. But the second one, again, you're using that, your subject matter knowledge on IT controls, IT environment. You're using that knowledge to suggest controls that they need to implement. So I think the question I asked kind of addressed both. But again, you're testing against standards, but your knowledge of the framework and how companies are trying to implement it gives you that edge on how to help them. So they might even call you and say, you know what? I don't even know how to put my profiles together. Come do a gap assessment. So they may not call it an organizational profile because, again, it's a framework. So an organization might literally hire auditors to come do a gap assessment. What's a gap assessment? Where are we and where do we need to be? And then based on the results of that gap assessment, identify and suggest controls that need to be implemented to address those gaps. Are you guys following? Are you guys following? So do you guys see how
Yes.
what your role as an auditor or what you know as an auditor helps you based on what companies might be doing? And another thing you need to remember, some of the words that are used in CSF may not be what organizations use. So like I said, they may not call it an organizational profile. They might say, we just want to know where we stand. We want to do a gap assessment. And I've actually done some, when I used to work in consulting, we did gap assessments for companies. So think of it as a test. So the gap assessment is done as a full-blown, we still do the complete audit like we're doing SSA 18. The difference is that it's not going to be given to customers. It's a test so that they know where all their issues are. They address those issues before we then do the full-blown real audit. Do you guys see that example? So that might be even SOX, like a gap assessment. Where are we? And a lot of companies, because SOX is for publicly traded companies, right? So if a company was private and then they're public, they have a period of time before they need to be compliant with SOX. So during that time, a lot of them do gap assessments, right? To know, okay, are we where we're supposed to be? Okay, if we're not, how do we address it before our real assessment starts? Okay, so that's just an example of that implication for audit. For compliance rules, think of the 3 lines of defense. The compliance function is essentially working hand in hand, right, with your first line of defense, making sure you're implementing all those right controls. So here, they might be helping organizations. I think this goes to the question that was asked earlier, to actually develop their organizational profile. They might call it something else, but they are really just trying to say, the same thing that we're just talking about, gap assessment, but being done internally from a compliance function. So remember, the compliance function is responsible for the internal compliance with different regulations, right? And part of what compliance can do is say, let's give an example. So maybe it's a company that's not really mature and the compliance function is a new one that's being implemented. One of the things they would then do is use a framework such as NIST to guide how they structure their compliance activities. Let me pause there. Do you guys understand what I just said? Do you guys get what I just said about compliance and how you could use a framework? So let's say a framework for maybe a new company that's not mature, or maybe a company that wants to just revamp its compliance function. One thing they could do is say, okay, we're going to use this NIST framework. It doesn't mean they're going to copy it, but they're going to use that framework and consider it as a way to develop whatever they want to do for their company. They may not use all the parts, but they will just use it to inform the structure, the governance structure that they put in place. Let me see if you guys are listening. Can you guys hear me? Am I still live?
Loud and clear.
Okay,
Yes.
so you guys see how the implication is, right? And then of course they need to work with stakeholders to implement the controls to meet the target profiles and desired outcomes. So it's not just about saying, I know what the gap is, or I know what to implement. Actually, compliance would work to follow up, make sure people are doing what they're actually supposed to do to really move things across the finish line. Okay, so let's summarize here, and then we'll do a final Q&A before we wrap up. So again, as a reminder, the CSF is intended to provide guidance on practices and standards. It's not prescribing specific outcomes, but the fact that it's not prescribing outcomes, I don't want you to think it makes it less important. It's still important because those guidelines are important, right? Those guidelines are key, and they can make a difference between a company knowing what to do and what not to do. Because if a company actually follows a framework such as the CSF, right, it can help improve their control environment, and with that improved control environment, it gives them a better chance of meeting their compliance requirements with standards. Do you guys get that? So do you understand that? So even though it's not prescribing outcomes, it's giving well, I shouldn't use the word proper. It's giving guidance, right, on the IT environment, the controls. And if a control environment is based on the CSF, they've really done their job, it can improve their security posture, which ultimately helps them meet compliance needs. So if they've done all they're supposed to do, when they need to perform an IT audit for whatever systems, it should technically be good and be effective if they've followed the standard requirements. Well, I don't want to call them requirements, the guidance that was provided by CSF. Do you guys understand that? Because I want you to understand the link between CSF, the importance, and why companies usually talk about frameworks is because it tells them well, it doesn't tell them what to do, it tells them what to consider for implementation that would overall then give them a better outcome with their compliance needs. Are you guys still there with me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think that really is all I had for you today. So let's do a quick review and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. Review today, you guys learned about NIST CSF 2.0. I gave you the definition, the explanation. We went really detailed into the 2.0 components, what are the components, guys? Let me see them in the chat. What are the 3 components we talked about? We just talked about 3 key components for NIST CSF 2.0. Core, organizational profile, and the tiers. All right. Okay. And with core, we have those 6 functions. With profiles, you have the current and target, and then we have those 4 tiers. Great. And then we talked about implications for your IT audit and compliance career. Having this knowledge that I've shared with you today, honestly, it just lets you understand what it's about. And then depending on whether you go into audit and compliance, how you're working in that organization might be different. What you might be called upon to do might be different, but that's really it. And I think the question we got earlier about a practical example on how you would respond to a hack or something based on a framework or guidelines, that kind of gives you that explanation as well. So thank you all for joining me. I did want to make sure I gave you guys this bonus so that you guys understand how to review and potentially, what's the word I'm looking for? Interpret, that's the word. To review and interpret the information in the framework and then also align it with what you've already learned in the course. So thank you all. I see you all in the chat. You guys have a great rest of the day. So thank you everybody for joining me for the session today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks, guys.